Throughout human history, all manner of disturbing punishments have been employed that defy comprehension. Some we have already covered in our previous 3 videos on the subject, yet there are still plenty more to discuss today, focusing on examples designed to completely destroy the body, avoid its desecration, or simply forget about a person altogether. The first method of execution we will be covering is garrotting. This is a relatively simple method of execution when compared to the complexities of methods such as being hanged, drawn and quartered. Garrotting is the strangulation of the condemned with some kind of ligature, usually a length of wire, chain or rope. This was used as a method of judicial execution and also became a form of criminal murder. Some of the first known examples of garrotting can be traced to ancient Rome. The Laqueus used to dispose of conspirators during Lucius Sergius Catilina's failed attempt to become consul. In China during the Qing dynasty and in the Ottoman Empire, death by garrotting was carried out with a bowstring. The condemned would be tied to a post with 2 holes for the bowstring to be threaded. They would then have the bowstring pulled tight around their neck until they were dead. This method of execution was reserved for nobles, where bodily desecration was to be avoided. Both cultures placed value on the dead's body being whole after death, something that garrotting could offer. Conversely, in Middle Age Europe, beheading was reserved for the nobility, executioners favoured and paid well for their ability to cleanly and quickly remove the head, whereas garrotting would be likely used to execute commoners. Garrotting would develop into a different method of execution. Death by strangulation by either hanging or garrotting with a ligature can be a disturbing spectacle. For example, when the neck breaks in hanging, it can take as long as 4 minutes until the person dies, during which time they are likely still conscious and struggling to breathe. Instead, the garrotte veal was developed. As an execution device, it comprised of a stool on which the condemned would sit. They would be bound to a post as to stop them from moving whilst being garrotted. Around their neck, a hinged iron collar would be closed. The execution would be caused by the turning of a screw or blade that ran through the post. The screw or blade would be positioned in such a way that it would enter the condemned's neck and sever their spinal column, which would cause an instant death. The goal was not to strangle, but rather instantly and humanely execute. However, it would not always go as planned. If the prisoner moved or if they were not restrained properly, the blade or screw would not sever the spinal column as intended. Instead, it would burrow its way into the neck, through the windpipe, and even into the mouth. This method of execution was favoured during the Spanish Inquisition, again as a humane method of execution. For those convicted heretics who had converted to Christianity, rather than being burned alive, a garrotte was used. Seen as a more humane method than hanging and beheading, the garrotte veal became favoured by many throughout history. During the Napoleonic Peninsular War, French forces used the garrotte against those who opposed their rule. In 1832, Spanish King Ferdinand VII banned hanging as a form of execution, on the basis that it took too long and was an indecent form of execution. The garrotte veal became the standard form of execution in Spain, later spreading to other Spanish colonies such as in the Philippines and Cuba. The execution method of garrotting was not limited to judicial executions. It was favoured by criminal gangs as a silent method of murder. Possessing a length of rope or piano wire is not as immediately obvious as to intent, as say to a knife or gun. As well as murder, garrotting became a popular method of mugging. The victim would be strangled, either with the offender's arm or ligature. During 19th century Britain, the garrotte panic swept the country. Regardless of how many people were garrotted, instances were widely reported by the press. The garrotting of a member of parliament and an 80-year-old man captured the public's attention. All manner of anti-garrotting devices and clothing were worn, including by the police. In 1963, Parliament passed the Garrotting Act, setting the sentence for garrotting as flogging. Execution by the garrotte veal offered the condemned a quick death, yet it remained one of the more disturbing deaths if done incorrectly. However, there is something still disturbing about a swift mechanical death caused by simply turning a handle. Whilst the death may not be as grisly as other discussed in this series, it nevertheless deserves its disturbing reputation. Next, we have execution by cannon. There can be few execution methods as dramatic and as bombastic as being blown from the gun. This method was favoured by the Mughal and colonial rulers of India. It gained infamy during the British occupation of India. This method of execution is relatively simple. The condemned is lashed to a cannon, the small of their back, against the muzzle. The cannon was often not loaded with ammunition, but instead a blank cartridge, but still filled with gunpowder. In some instances, a grape shot was used. A grape shot consisted of small metal cannonballs tied together and then wrapped in a cloth. Once fired, the cannon acts akin to a shotgun, firing the small cannonballs in a wide arc. As you might imagine, the results were devastating. Eyewitness accounts of such execution methods noted how the head of the condemned would fly many meters into the air. The arms would be shot as far as 100 yards away. The torso would be eviscerated from the force of the firing. The legs would simply fall below the muzzle of the cannon as the rest of the body was blown to pieces. There were, however, other dangers to this execution method. The human shrapnel of bone could cause damage to anyone who was too close, and there are accounts of such injuries being caused. So too could the incorrect ammunition be loaded. In one example, grape shot was loaded into the cannon and fired accidentally into a crowd of people who were observing the execution. Other issues could arise if the condemned managed to slip or fall from their position of having their back against the muzzle. In such instances, the condemned would lose perhaps an arm and would have to be killed with a coup de grace shot to the head. Portuguese explorer Francisco de Almeida is credited as being one of the first users of this method of execution. The practice spread across the Portuguese Empire, from Mozambique to Sri Lanka. The Mughal Empire on the Indian subcontinent too were prominent practitioners of execution by cannon. A Mughal emperor by the name of Humayun is said to have executed 100 Afghan prisoners by blowing them from a gun. Crimes that affected the Mughal military were punished by execution by cannon. Deserters and those who stole from the military stores too were executed by cannon. The complete destruction of the body and explosive scattering of limbs had an important religious function. This method of execution affected both Hindu and Muslim burial rites, meaning the condemned was denied proper burial rites as befit their faith. Blowing from a gun was also used widely in Afghanistan as late as the 19th century. One practitioner was Abdur Rahman Khan. It is estimated that he oversaw the executions of 100,000 people during his 20-year reign, and in 1 year, 24 people were executed by cannon. But it was the British on the Indian subcontinent who became synonymous with the practice. Before the establishment of the British Empire in India, the execution method was used by the British East India Trading Company. It was a common punishment for Indian soldiers working for the company who had mutinied. It was often the case that the leaders of such mutinies were executed by cannon as to serve a grim example to the rest of the soldiers. It was used during the 1857 Indian Rebellion, otherwise known as the Sepoy Mutiny. We do have a separate video on this topic, but in summary, there was a massive rebellion of Indian soldiers against the East India Company. For the mutineers, all manner of punishment was employed as the British sought retribution for the massacres committed by the Sepoys. Around 50 mutineers were executed by cannon by the British, though many more were executed by other means. Execution by cannon was likely a quick death, albeit one that was dramatic. Its use on the Indian subcontinent and its connotations of desecration and colonial oppression will mean it remains one of the more disturbing execution methods in history. And finally, we have the oubliettes. The horror of the medieval dungeon, with its many torture devices and those broken by them, can only be outdone by a place even darker. The oubliette, meaning the forgotten room, was a place of claustrophobic darkness and decay. Very often, the prisoner would be left to rot, starve, and decay amongst the bones of those who were already disposed of. An oubliette was often located in the dungeon of a given castle. Often carved out of the rock, an oubliette was a small cell built below the main dungeon, often accessible by a narrow downward shaft which the prisoner would be thrown. Within the main dungeon, all manner of tortures and punishments were inflicted, resulting in all manner of body fluids dropping to the floor. These fluids often drained into the oubliette, adding to the horror. In some oubliettes, spikes were added to the floor just to make it that much more uncomfortable. Often, the oubliette was sealed by a trapdoor, eliminating all light. Within the cramped space, unable to move and forced to stand, they would remain. It could be the case that food and water was thrown down to keep the prisoner alive, but in other instances, the prisoner would be left to starve to death, their remains to fester and rot, adding to the horrible ambience for the next prisoner. It should be noted that imprisonment in the medieval period was not at all common. For lesser crimes, some form of corporal punishment was used as to prevent reoffending and to deter others. For more serious offences, capital punishment was used. Torture was often used to extract important information, or would form part of the death sentence for serious crimes such as treason. It would only be those of significant political importance that would be imprisoned, until such time that they could be ransomed off or otherwise disposed of. Often such high-value prisoners were kept alive in relative comfort, in a form of house arrest in apartments often above the dungeons. Sometimes, however, where a noble's fate was death, they would be kept within the dungeon or even the oubliette. One example of a prisoner who would fit this description was English King Richard II. After he was deposed in 1399, he was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. As to avoid any of his loyal lords from reinstating him to the throne, he was held in the oubliette of Pontefract Castle, and is thought to have been starved to death after 4 months held in the oubliette and main dungeon. The oubliette was often built so that the prisoner could not comfortably stand or sit, or even move. One notable example is that of the oubliette of the Tower of London, known as Little Ease. It was designed to be less than 4 feet by 4 feet. It made it impossible for the prisoner to stand up or lie down, forcing them into an uncomfortable crouched position. Guy Fawkes of the attempted gunpowder plot was held in this small cell before his execution, but the oubliette at Warwick Castle was smaller still. It measured only 3 feet by 3 feet, accessible only by a narrow shaft through a small gate. Once inside, the prisoner was unable to stand, forced into a prone position. Warwick Castle was built in 1068 by William the Conqueror, with an oubliette installed to deal with unruly lords who might oppose his rule. Whilst there have been a myriad of tortures and executions that have been employed throughout human history, what unites them all is the unique human propensity for imaginative cruelty. Sadly, the number of creative methods of inflicting pain and suffering is something that unites all nations and all peoples.